The Silent Hero of Riverside Park, Part 1, The Man of Routine. Everyone who entered Riverside Park through the East Gate knew him. Every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, he would appear, taking the same slow steps along the same path. In his right hand, a brown leather bag. In his left, cane. His name was George Wilson, but in the park, he was simply known as Uncle George. At 73, he looked much older than his age. His hair had turned white, his face was etched with deep wrinkles. His eyes always carried the same expression, empty, distant, as if he were living in another time. He always wore the same outfit, dark blue slacks, a light blue shirt, and a brown cardigan. On his feet, old but polished black shoes. At first, people were curious. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Why was he always alone? But over time, they grew used to him. Uncle George became part of the park, just like the old oak tree or the central fountain. The chess table beneath the great oak seemed like it belonged to him. Every morning he would arrive, pull a chess set from his bag, arrange the pieces, and start playing. But who was he playing with? That was the mystery, because Uncle George was always alone. He played against himself, first moving the white pieces, then slowly walking around the table to move the black one, as if there were two people inside him. Sometimes he would stare at the board for minutes, lost in thought. Other times he'd move swiftly, making several moves in a row. Maria, the park janitor, had been startled the first time she saw him. "What is this man doing?" she had asked a coworker. Her friend just shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe this is what loneliness looks like." Loneliness. Yes, there was a cloud of solitude that seemed to follow Uncle George. Very few people ever dared approach him. There was something in his eyes, something that pushed people away. Was it pain? Was it anger? No one could say for sure. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived near the park, watched him from her window every morning. "That man," she'd say to her husband, "he's like a ghost. He never talks, never smiles, just moves those pieces over and over again." Mr. Henderson was more sympathetic. "Maybe he's a war veteran," he suggested. "Some men come back from war and shut themselves off. They live in their own world." But that was only a guess. No one knew where Uncle George had come from. No one knew where he lived, where he was born, or if he had any family. He just came to the park each morning, played his game, and quietly disappeared in the afternoon. Children were curious about it. Sometimes they'd sneak up and try to watch his game, but Uncle George never seemed to notice. It was as if the world around him didn't exist, only the chessboard did. One time, little Tommy worked up the courage to approach him. "Sir," he asked, "will you play with me?" Uncle George looked up, his eyes briefly softening. Then he shook his head. "No, son," he said, his voice low and tired. "This game's not for you." Tommy was disappointed, but he didn't insist. There was something final in Uncle George's tone, like there was no room for discussion. Others in the park tried to reach out too. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired teacher, once attempted to strike up a conversation about chess. Uncle George just nodded and went back to playing. Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged woman who jogged in the mornings, once offered him a cheerful, "Good morning." Uncle George gave a polite nod, but said nothing. Over time, everyone got the message. Uncle George didn't want to talk. He lived in his own world, and people began to respect that. They stopped trying to engage him, but that didn't stop them from talking about him. The legend of Uncle George grew among the park regulars. Some said he was a former teacher. Others thought he used to be an artist. Some believed he had lost his family, which is why he had shut himself off. Part 2. When curiosity grew. Months went by. Uncle George's routine never changed. Rain or shine, snow or sun, he was always there at 9. Even in winter, when the park was empty and silent, he'd appear, wrapped in a thick coat, holding a steaming thermos. One winter day, the park was nearly deserted. Just Uncle George, sitting in his usual spot under the falling snow. That day, Sarah Martinez was walking through the park. She worked as a nurse at the nearby hospital and liked to pass through the park on her way home from the night shift. When she saw Uncle George playing chess in the cold, her heart ached. "Sir," she said gently as she approached, "it's freezing. You'll get sick out here." Uncle George looked up. When his eyes met Sarah's, it was like they were traveling from a faraway place. They stared at each other for a moment. "I'm fine," he finally said. "Thank you." Sarah hesitated, but something made her stay. "At least let me pour you some tea from my thermos," she offered. Uncle George hesitated. Then he nodded. "Thank you. That's kind of you." Sarah poured him a cup, and as he took it, she noticed his hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but something else. Constant, uncontrollable shake. "Thank you," he said after a sip. "You're very kind." "I'm Sarah," she said, trying to smile. "I work at the hospital." "I'm George," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." It was the longest conversation anyone had had with him in the park. Sarah was surprised and glad. Maybe he wasn't so unreachable after all. But the next day, when Sarah returned, Uncle George was back to being silent. She said hello, but he only nodded, said nothing. She thought about him a lot after that. Why was he like this? Why could he talk one day and fall silent the next? What kind of pain was buried inside him? Spring arrived. The park came alive with blooming flowers and green trees. More people started coming outside, and Uncle George, as always, was still there. Same time, same place. He began to attract more attention. Young couple Jennifer and Michael often took walks in the park. They noticed him every time. "Who is that man?" Jennifer asked one day. "I don't know," Michael replied. "But he looks so lonely." "I think I'll go talk to him," Jennifer said. "I wouldn't," Michael warned. "He clearly wants to be left alone." But Jennifer was curious. One day, she worked up the courage and approached. "Hi," she said. "I'm Jennifer. You're really good at chess." Uncle George looked up, then turned back to the board. "Thank you," he said softly. "Who are you playing with?" she asked. He paused for a long time, then finally said, "Myself." "Why?" The question seemed to make him uncomfortable. His hands began to tremble a little more. "Because," he said at last, "my best opponent is me." Jennifer tried to make sense of it. Uncle George continued, "When you play against yourself, you can't cheat, you can't lie to yourself, and you have to live with every move you make." His words hit Jennifer deeply. This man wasn't just playing chess. He was confronting himself. "You're very wise," she said. Uncle George gave a sad smile. "Being wise isn't always a gift," he said. "Sometimes it's a burden." Jennifer wanted to ask more, but he had already retreated back into silence. The moment was over. Still, that conversation spread through the park. People began to repeat what he had said. "I play with myself because I'm my best opponent." What did it mean? Everyone had their own theories, but one thing was certain. Uncle George wasn't just a lonely old man. There was a story behind his silence, a story waiting to be uncovered. Part 3. The first clue. By the time summer arrived, the park was in full bloom. Children ran around, families had picnics, and seniors chatted on benches. And yet, Uncle George remained in his usual spot, continuing his routine like clockwork. Around this time, someone began observing him more closely. David Chen. David was a history professor at a nearby university and often took walks through the park. The first time he saw Uncle George, something about the man struck him as familiar. David's own father had been a war veteran. He fought in Korea and came back a different man, withdrawn, distant, emotionally detached. For years, he barely spoke to his family. And now, David saw the same signs in Uncle George. The trembling hands, the vacant stare, the silence. These were all common in men who had seen war. David started to wonder, was Uncle George a veteran too? At 73, that would place him in the Vietnam War era. One day, David gathered the courage to approach. "Hello," he said. "I'm David. I teach history." Uncle George looked up at him. For a moment, there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. "History," he said. "Interesting profession." "Yes," David replied. "I'm especially focused on military history." At those words, Uncle George's body language shifted. He seemed a bit more tense. His hands trembled slightly more than before. "Military history," Uncle George repeated. "That's interesting. I've been studying the Vietnam War in particular," David added carefully. There was a long pause. Uncle George's eyes drifted into the distance, like he was traveling back in time. "Vietnam," he said finally. "That was a long time ago." David's heart raced. "Was that a confession? Were you there?" he asked gently. Uncle George stayed quiet for a while. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said, "a long, long time ago." David had so many questions, but he didn't push. That short exchange told him all he needed. Uncle George was a Vietnam veteran, and suddenly everything made sense. The trauma, the silence, the daily ritual of chess. It was all part of how he coped. That evening, David couldn't stop thinking about it. What had this man lived through? What had he seen? What made him shut down so completely? The next day, David saw him again. But now, he looked at Uncle George differently. Not as a lonely old man, but as a silent hero. A man who had served his country and come back broken, trying to survive in his own way. Still, David didn't tell anyone what he had learned. He respected Uncle George's privacy. If he wanted to talk, he would. Days passed. David continued walking through the park, occasionally nodding from a distance. Uncle George would acknowledge him with a slight tilt of his head. One day, as David passed by the chess table, he stopped. Uncle George was so focused on his game, he didn't notice him. David glanced at the board and watched the way he played. Every move was calculated, deliberate. There was no doubt this man was skilled. "Nice game," David said softly. Uncle George looked up and smiled slightly. "Thank you," he said. "Would you teach me?" David asked. Uncle George hesitated. "I'm not sure," he replied. "It's been a long time since I've taught anyone." "Why not?" Uncle George took a deep breath. "Because chess isn't just a game to me. It's my way of coping." David understood. Chess was his therapy, a way to keep his mind busy and hold the darkness at bay. "I understand," David said sincerely, "and I respect that." Uncle George looked at him. Great, few people had ever understood him like this. "Maybe one day," Uncle George said, "I'll teach you." That was the first promise he had made in years. David was moved. Part 4. A bond forms. On a hot day in August, the park was more crowded than usual. Kids played by the fountain, young people lounged on the grass, and older folks gathered in the shade. Uncle George was in his usual spot, but something was different. He wasn't lost in his game. David was walking through the park when he noticed Uncle George motioning. He was pointing to the seat across the chess. Was he being invited to play? David approached excited. "Really?" he asked. Uncle George nodded. "I made a promise," he said. David sat down as Uncle George began arranging the pieces. "I'll take white," he said. "You can play black." David agreed, and the game began. Uncle George made the first move, a simple, but David could already tell this man had years of experience. At first, they played in silence, but then George began to speak. Chess, he said, is a lot like life. Every move has consequences. Every choice takes you somewhere. You're really good, David said. I've had years to practice, Uncle George replied. Long nights. Alone. Chess kept me company. When did you learn? There was a pause. During the service, George said. We used to play in the barracks. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his military service. What unit were you in? David asked gently. George was quiet for a long time. Special Forces, he said. Green Berets. David's breath caught. Green Berets. One of the most elite units in the U.S. Army. The toughest missions. The highest risks. Wow, David said. That's impressive. It was, George said with a bitter smile. But being important sometimes comes with a price. David understood. Special Forces soldiers often carried the deepest scars. They kept playing. When George took one of David's pawns, he said, there are losses in chess, just like in life. David knew what he meant. This man had lost more than pieces on a board. How do you cope with those losses? George made another move. You don't, he said quietly. You just learn to live, one move at a time. His words sank deep into David's heart. Uncle George wasn't just playing to win. He was trying to survive. The game ended. George won, of course, and they sat quiet. Thank you, David said. This meant a lot to me. Me too, George replied. It was a turning point. For the first time in decades, Uncle George had opened up. He had shared something real. David left the park that day feeling heavy. What kind of pain had this man endured? The next day, David returned. George smiled at him. Want to play again? David's heart lifted. It meant trust. From then on, they played regularly. And with each game, George opened up a little more. One day, David asked, do you have family? George was silent for a long time. I did, he said. A long time ago. What happened? I lost, George said. Or maybe they lost me. I'm not sure anymore. David's heart ached. After I came back from war, everything was different, George continued. I was different. My wife tried to understand. My kids didn't recognize me. And honestly, I didn't recognize them. He paused. Tears welled in his eyes. One day I came home and they were gone. They left a note. George, we love you, but this isn't you. If you ever find the old George, come find us. David felt a lump in his throat. Did you ever find them? George shook his head. No, because the old George died in Vietnam. Just like the other. The pain in his voice was crushing. His hands were trembling more than ever. David gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry. I've gotten used to it, George said. It's been 50 years. David was stunned. 50 years of silence. 50 years of guilt. 50 years of loneliness. Part 5. The photo and the past. Late November brought the first snowflakes to Riverside Park. George kept coming every morning, though lately he seemed distracted. Since the Veterans Day event, old memories had been resurfaced. He spoke less, focused even less on chess. One particularly windy day, while packing up early, a gust knocked over George's bag. Papers scattered, and David stooped to help. That's when he found a faded photo. It showed 5 young soldiers in uniform, arms around each other, beaming. And in the center, George, a younger, smiling, vibrant version. George froze when he saw it. That's my team, he said quietly, clutching the photo to his chest. Mickey, Big Jim, Rodriguez, they all died. I'm the only one left. His voice carried farther than he realized. People nearby, Sarah Martinez, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Rodriguez, the retired teacher, began to gather. Sarah stepped forward gently. What happened? He asked. George looked around, eyes wet. Then he spoke. We were ambushed in Cambodia. It was a covert mission. No one knew we were even there. Mickey took the first bullet. Big Jim stepped on a mine trying to shield me. Rodriguez, sniper shot. I survived. I hid. And then the rescue chopper came and took only me. His voice cracked. Why me? Why not them? They had lives waiting for them. Families. Futures. I had no right to outlive. David placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe because someone had to tell their story. George looked up. I haven't told anyone in 50 years. But now you have, said Sarah. And we're listening. The crowd, once distant strangers, now looked at him with deep respect. No longer just the quiet man in the park. He was a living witness, a brother in arms, a survivor. Part 6, Honoring the Fallen. From that day on, everything changed. George was still quiet, still reserved, but no longer isolated. He talked to people. Children waved at him. Sarah came by often, her nursing background helping him navigate the long shadow of PTSD. 50 years alone, George once said. Not anymore, Sarah replied. David and George continued their games, but now George also shared memories. Mickey once adopted a stray cat on base, he chuckled. Called it General. Big Jim, he smiled, was the strongest guy I knew, but he loved flowers. And Rodriguez? He wanted to open a school after the war. Always had a book in his hand. These memories hurt, but they also healed. In December, the park community planned something special. Tribute to Mickey, Big Jim, and Rodriguez. George wore his uniform for the first time in decades. Standing before the modest crowd, he spoke. They were my brothers, and for too long, I only remembered how they died. But now, I remember how they lived. He smiled. Mickey loved to laugh, Jim loved to protect, Rodriguez loved to dream. He held up the photo, and they would have wanted me to live. Really. Part 7. A circle complete. Spring came. George was now a central figure in the park. The children adored him. The elderly sought his stories. And David, he was more than a chess student now. He was a true friend. David, George said one morning, because of you, I've started living. No, George, David smiled. You were already living. You just forgot how to notice. One day, a young man approached. Military bearing, buzz cut. He walked straight to George. Excuse me, sir. Are you George Wilson? Yes. And you are? Michael Rodriguez, Jr. My father was Carlos Rodriguez. George nearly lost his breath. Rodriguez's son? Yes. My mom told me everything about my dad and you. George's eyes filled. He said I'd be your godfather. You still can be, Michael smiled. She's been looking for you for years. Her name's Maria. She'd love to meet you. A week later, George and David traveled to San Antonio. When Maria opened the door, she said simply, George Wilson. At last. They embraced. She handed him a box, Rodriguez's letters, photos, medals. Carlos always trusted you, she said. He wanted you in his child's life. George could hardly sleep. That night, for the first time in decades, he slept peacefully. Part 8. Staying in the game. As summer bloomed, Riverside Park had changed. So had George. He no longer sat alone. He played chess with Emma, who now knew how to move the pieces. You have to be ready for the consequences of your move, he told. Like you, right, Uncle George? He smiled. Yes, sweetheart, just like me. And then one afternoon, as he looked up at the sky with David beside him, George chuckled. What is it? Asked David. Just remembering what Mickey used to say. George, you're too serious. Smile a little more. David laughed. So whose move is it? George reached for his piece. Mine. And he made his move. The end.